Nathan, it's great seeing you. So I always like to ask a little warm-up question. So before you came to were nominated to the FCC, outside of Washington, the insiders of Washington didn't really know who you were. You're this blank slate, and then all of a sudden you get thrust into the FCC nomination process during a turbulent time, and you survived it. You made it through. But what made you decide to leave the warm weather of Florida and come to Washington and work at NTIA?
Well, Rick, so I got hired to my job in Florida to work on developing a market around used wireless devices. And for the company I was with was, among other things, the biggest device recycler in the world at the time. But just as important is putting used devices from where they originate in the most developed countries into countries where there's more of a market for them, which is very often developing countries, and it reduces environmental footprint, gets more mileage out of the device, and it's also there are also various ancillary benefits to this at one remove for the device manufacturers. So I had been in the unusual position for an American of trying to compete directly against Huawei in different markets, and I realized they were really good. It made me think, well, if I have the chance to work on the policy side, what would I bring to the table that a more traditional telecom regulation background wouldn't necessarily prepare you for? And I guess, the answer is the international competition, device competition aspect, and then what you need to know about the international device market in order to make that work from a business intelligence point of view. I thought that would be interesting stuff to bring to DC, but I certainly didn't imagine that I would be bringing it to the FCC. I just thought I would sort of, merge gently into the swamp, sink to a nice, comfortable level. No, I felt like we were really in a historic place developing national consensus around the realities of the evolution in the telecom market and telecom capabilities and how those apply to commerce. So when I got the call from Commerce, then that was an easy decision. I said, this is my chance. They're not going to call me again. So I better make the most of it. And I don't know, things seem to have worked out.
So what did you learn at NTIA that you've now brought to your role as an FCC commissioner?
Well, the NTIA is one of the, it's one of the unsung heroes of DC to some degree, although I guess it's a little more sung now. But in 2020, it wasn't necessarily one of the most widely known agencies, which is really a pity. It's a fantastic agency. The research lab out in Colorado has great staff and does great work. The engineering group generally at NTIA is very strong. And we all owe a debt of gratitude to them, or we should if we were more familiar with their work, I guess, prior to being thrust into the limelight with BEAD. So, the very first week I was at the NTIA, I got thrust into a really, really thorny question where there was a dispute between the federal government and a private sector over spectrum allocation. So that's where I went from looking at spectrum allocation questions from the perspective of someone who's trying to write options and get a futures market going, and can opportunistically choose when to be and when not to be in the market, what devices to be in, et cetera. To having to think about the larger question, how do these equities work out? What are the downstream effects on everyone else? And then, of course, I've been on the other side of many issues of this type when I was at the FCC, maybe even that issue. But I guess the thing that you would learn, or that I learned working at NTIA that I couldn't have learned anyplace else, was just how complex these decisions are and how many ways there are to get them wrong. And I think that's one area where the NTIA and the FCC work really well together and where everyone is really trying their hardest to do the best. And the other side of it is that the American approach to spectrum licensing, of course, auctions have become the international standard, and they were invented here. And we even wound up collecting some Nobels for that, so that's good. It wound up becoming the international standard, and what we've seen is a huge intensification of the degree to which the ordinary person can use telecommunications equipment, services, and have indirect benefits from those, as well as public safety and other actors use them. So it was an education on a number of fronts.
Well, that's great. One of the things that impressed me most when I first met you was that you are such a policy wonk. You like to deep dive on everything. I don't know how you spend enough time in a day, because it's never just, where are the winds going? You want to know every single detail. But here we are at the State of the Net, And it's been a few years since there was a major political fight on our favorite topic in this town, net neutrality. So a town, in this town, everyone has a view. I'm sure I could take a poll here and everyone has a view. But what do you think is up next for net neutrality? Is it dead? Is it going forward? What's happening at the FCC?
Well, I guess, Rick, my answer to that, I would ask you and maybe everyone here to just think about it. When was the last time your ISP blocked a legal website, prevented you from connecting an application of your choice, whether that's a physical appliance, a TV, a phone, computer, tablet, baby monitor, any sort of smart device, smart fridges if you have those, smart toasters, juiceros. Obviously your ISP isn't stopping you from connecting any of those things. Your ISP isn't stopping you from running any legal application either on your computer or as a network application. Your ISP is probably not blocking or throttling either. So my question is, do we not have de facto net neutrality at this moment, either in the terms that were first announced in 2004 by Chairman Powell and were subsequently consecrated by a vote of the Commission the next year? Do we not have net neutrality de facto as a market practice now in terms of disaffiliation between fast lanes of affiliated content companies with ISPs? I think the growth of the OTT sector has conclusively answered that. So as far as what's next for net neutrality, I don't know where you go with net neutrality once you already have net neutrality. Of course, if net neutrality means different things to different people, if it means all the things that I've just laid out, then we have it without the need for a law. I would also note that that the market practices today go beyond various net neutrality laws that Congress has offered up at different times. If the question is, what does an upcoming Title II order look like? That's also kind of fraught. We're in a very different legal environment now than we were in 2015. Now, I'm not really an appellate lawyer or an admin lawyer, but even I've noticed, that a system where you have to rewrite so much of the statute via the forbearance power, as we saw in the 2015 Open Internet Order, might not be viable today because the forbearance power might face broader scrutiny. And it's also probably the case that some of the past case law on the forbearance power was maybe not as aggressively pursued into the question of the viability of the forbearance power itself. And if we wound up adopting an order that then wound up seeing the forbearance power sharply trimmed back, this would have implications for people who are not even ISPs, right? It would have implications for everyone who is an ILEC, really. So there are a lot of ways I think a Title II order would have to be very, very carefully thought through. And I would question whether Title II brings anything to the table in terms of expected consumer benefits. Now, you try to be fair to both sides. People who are big advocates of Title II would say that, what we really need are price caps and must-build requirements, that we really need those in order to ensure that that ISPs have got to provide everyone with physical access and with reasonably priced access to the internet, as with modern broadband, that this is a necessity to be a first-class citizen of the United States in this day and age. And I want to pause for a minute to acknowledge the force of those arguments. But I guess I would say once you've got a build-out requirement and you've got a price cap, the thing that's missing is the money to fund it. And it's not clear to me that people are really prepared for the implications of a far greater federal involvement in broadband funding than has been the case up until this point, even under BEAD and the Infrastructure and Jobs Act and RDOF and all the other programs that are out there. So I think there are ways to get to those outcomes without having to bring down the full force of Title II, having to trim it, and then having those trimming approaches being closely scrutinized in the courts. I think we can probably do better than that. But on the other hand, no one really cares what I think on this question, Rick. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen regardless of what I have to say about it. But I think it's worth throwing up some of those flags right now.
So, following up on that question, do you think the FCC has the authority to regulate internet companies like Google, Facebook, TikTok? Some of your colleagues have called TikTok a national security threat. They're out, they're here. But what do you think? Does the FCC have authority to do something in that space?
Well, I wouldn't say that we don't have any tools whatsoever. There was, I think, a pretty wide-ranging public debate over whether the FCC had any authority to provide an agency interpretation of Section 230. I think that was pretty conclusively addressed by Tom Johnson's blog post in October 2020. It's funny, I have to keep calling it a blog post even though it was written like a very tight legal brief, except with a little informal language here and there. But at the time, Tom was the general counsel of the FCC, and I think he did a great job rounding up the relevant law and drawing the right conclusions from it. So I don't think there's much question that there is some ability to interpret that. And if it's also possible, and I'm not saying that this is happening within the commission, but I just want to point to it as a possibility. It's also possible that if there were a defensible interpretation found that went along the lines of the sort of safe harbors that we're accustomed to seeing, conditioned on standards of conduct that would be very normal in securities law, then it would, I think, be conceivable to use the question of a conduct standard to condition the immunities that are granted under 230. But this is really just talking about a fairly narrow corner of the question of internet regulation writ large. And the first thing is, I don't know what an internet company is. I mean, I can go on Amazon and buy shoes, or I can go on Walmart and buy shoes, or whatever. I mean, there are lots of streaming services out there. Is everyone an internet company because they have a streaming service? Is a mom and pop shop, are they an internet company because they can do e-commerce? I don't know that it's really a well-defined category. And yet, at the same time, there's no question that many things that would have been delivered as traditional telephony services and that we would have regulated and that people expect us to regulate, so for example, in providing functional equivalents for the disabled, those are things where the FCC can't mandate that if it's a service that's delivered via an app like Zoom instead of via traditional telephony. We can't use some of the benefit granting capability that Congress has given us because it's no longer within our regulated sphere of competence. Likewise, in terms of media delivery, we always assumed that the FCC was the media regulator in the United States, but OTT video is almost totally unregulated, and there's not been a move yet to create a regulator with competence there or to bring it in line with broadcast and cable reg. So I don't really know what the answer is there either. Just generally speaking, the theme is increasingly that there's been a sector in the economy that we all use every day, and that's very important and that we like and don't want to damage, but that is completely unregulated, and that this also creates disparities and unequal playing fields when the competition is heavily regulated. And sometimes it creates absurdities where, for example, we're very upset under our regs about broadcast consolidation, but there's no problem whatsoever with OTT consolidation because it's assumed to be a national or international or for intergalactic, for all I know, market. And looking at things in this way, it becomes increasingly hard to justify. But these aren't really our calls to make; those reside with Congress.
So you've spoken a lot about your interest in cybersecurity issues. The Biden administration just released its strategy. What role do you see the FCC having in cybersecurity?
Well, I think it's really important that we step up and act in the areas where we're good at cybersecurity. And in the areas where we're not, we should back off and leave that to the domain experts. I don't think there's a broad mandate for the FCC to act in cybersecurity generally. However, signal security is another question. Signal security is another question, and that might take the form of, for example, a relatively low power but insidious worm or virus that could be used to co-opt devices, whether those are infrastructure devices or personal devices, to allow for example, mass Wi-Fi deauthorization or privilege escalation within corporate Wi-Fi networks, or distributed denial of spectrum attacks by the use of older devices and the security vulnerabilities that they bring with them when they're no longer supported. Because in many cases, you don't really know what the support term on an individual device is going to be. And so, and there's no way that you can force manufacturers to own support of a device for some amount of time under current frameworks. Now, since there are potential threats to the public use of spectrum, both here and then in terms of devices being used outside of their authorized FCC use, but within capabilities that could, for example, be flashed into firmware with a new firmware package. Because of this, I think there is an angle for us to start addressing the signal security question. As to exactly how far up the stack we go, I think we stay pretty low. It's not clear to me, though, that we stay entirely at the physical device level anymore when software control over devices is so prominent. And again, I view this as an emerging field. 10 years ago, we wouldn't have been that worried about it. Now we're talking about putting a lot of personal information on IoT devices. We're talking about finding greater economically more impactful uses for IoT devices. So that means that we have massive device proliferation, which is what we want. We aim for that. We want there to be a really vibrant manufacturing and development sector there, right? We're freeing up spectrum so that this can happen. We're looking at other countries that are seeing greater adoption of industrial, public safety, and medical 5G and saying, we want those advantages in the United States. We don't want to be a technological backwater. We don't want our people to live worse than they would otherwise because we can't plan to deal with this. But on the other hand, if you don't close the security threats on this, and if the FCC doesn't do its part in closing them, then we're leaving vulnerabilities that could be pretty alarming. Once you start talking about automatic traffic routing, once you start talking about people's medical information, implanted medical devices, all that kind of thing. Now that's an example of a sector that's worked really hard to close this question, and they did it through the FDA. But I think that's exactly why the FCC has to step up when there isn't a regulator that's as focused on the question as the FDA, when the stakes aren't as high with any individual device, and I think there is room for us to act there.
Well, we're talking cybersecurity, and Alan Davidson was here earlier today talking about the broadband resources that are going out, $40 billion. And so now we have this group of folks who are now coming online, and we're pushing hard for that. So you have another layer of cybersecurity to worry about. But how do you think the FCC is doing its mission to close the digital divide and make sure that everyone has access to high-speed internet access?
Well, it's sort of an interesting question, right? Because you can close the digital divide by putting more resources into existing technology, but you can also close the digital divide by opening up new areas of access that weren't really imagined before. Now, if you think back to 2004, one of the reasons that people really liked the idea of legally mandated net neutrality or Title II net neutrality or some approach was they were concerned about local cable companies getting monopolistic windfalls, and they were concerned about anti-consumer behavior in that area. And I'm not saying anyone did that. I'm not, assessing the rights or wrongs. I'm just saying that was an area of concern. Well, we've never had greater diversity in terms of physical media and in terms of population coverage for broadband. And it's really remarkable. If you look at the growth of the satellite sector or the fixed wireless sector, and that's independent, of course, of the huge amounts of capital that are being plowed into new fiber builds at this moment all over the country, sometimes public money, sometimes private money, sometimes a mix. But if you look at the diversity of media, there are now two companies, and I don't do endorsements, I can't name them on stage, but it's reported in the trade press, that have gone from trailing positions to leading positions, number 1 and 2 in the country, through deployment of fixed wireless access. Now that's leading in terms of population covered, not in terms of population subscribed, but these are still it's a very fast-growing sector. How did we get there? Not exactly through a benefit. We got there through auctioning the C-band, right? We got there by not looking at it in terms of needing to redistribute resources so much as in terms of needing to remove regulatory brakes on the development of a sector that wanted to invest. And I think that's a really interesting counterpoint to the idea that we always need a program. Sometimes what we need is fewer programs. Sometimes what we need is it's not as simple as just going in and cutting red tape. I don't want to caricature the process. But sometimes what we need to do is to look at the resources that are available and say, what's the highest and best use of it? How close are we to that? What are the obstacles? Who's going to get hurt along the way? What can we do to mitigate or avoid that harm? But unless we're trying to be creative about this kind of thing and recast how we're approaching the question, there's never really going to be enough to go around. It's much easier when you just have abundant spectrum and abundant fiber and abundant technological diversity. And all of a sudden someone who lived where they had one cable provider before might now have 2 plus 2 fixed wireless companies plus satellite. That's really inspiring. Now, It's not to say we don't have other programs as well. I'm proud of RDOF. I think that's going to come out, that's going to be successful. And I'm also proud of the mapping initiatives that are going to help us address the problems in all of the existing build-outs. It's an insoluble dilemma, right? Do we spend the money now? Do we wait until conditions are perfect before spending it? There's never exactly a right time. So I think those are some valuable efforts as well. And then I'm also very happy about our engagement with specific communities with specific needs, such as tribal governments and on this front. And generally, it's nice to see greater contacts opening up with state governments and with state governments developing greater capacity for broadband offices and for national mapping standards. So a lot of things going on that front, but before anything else, I'd point to just technological expansion of capacity as our single biggest success story.
Yeah, and on the tribal front, I've had several conversations with some tribal leaders, and the problem for them has been that they don't even have a personnel infrastructure, let alone technical infrastructure, to even apply. And I've heard stats of 50% of the eligible tribes have not even applied, and I think that has to do with us trying to do more to get folks in to educate of how they can actually apply for these funds coming out of NTIA. We were talking about resources that are out there. One of the oldest policy issues that I remember from back in my days was the FCC's Universal Service Fund. All the dollars that are coming from that, where they're going in this new broadband era, how do you see the broadband rollout, FCC, the Universal Fund, how all that playing together?
Yeah, it's the USF really. It's funny. Back in the day, and by back in the day I mean 100 years ago, universal service meant that the telephone service should have the same look and feel. So it was universal service in the sense that your iPhone doesn't act differently in Atlanta than it does in Chicago, right? The idea was that you should have consistency of dial tone, of the way that routing and long distance works, all that. Somehow the term went through a sea change, and now when we talk about universal service, we're talking about getting service to everyone. And I think pointing out that distinction, you said I'm a little bit of a nerd here, so I'm going to nerd out just a little bit. I mean,
my favorite part.
People who were there for it or who just studied it will recall that the Bell system prior to breakup was based on cross subsidies. It was based on, frankly, very often having pricing tiers of service that were rather disconnected from the underlying cost of provision in order to ensure that you could have that you could subsidize things in various ways. So if you had a long line with light traffic, that was not transparent to the consumer. You were charging on a distance basis, and it was AT&T's problem to get that line fully utilized. Or likewise, the same technical service provided to a business and to a household were billed on a differential basis so that the business was paying for the household. And likewise between urban and rural, because obviously in urban you have infrastructure advantages to scale that you don't have in rural. So the whole system was built on huge numbers of behind-the-scenes subsidies. And those were substantially weakened by the breakup, first of all. They were weakened again in '89, and by the time you get to '96, there's not much left of that. So you wind up with the idea of a fund to get to universality of service. 1996, let's recall, that was the era when you had pop-up long distance providers. I still remember dialing 1010 321, that kind of thing, right? And it was a time when landline phone service was a huge business. And the USF was built around this idea, that we would probably never have to raise the USF percentage around contribution factor over about 5%. And now it's routinely over 30%. It's hard to plan for in advance, too, because you don't know what it's going to be quarter to quarter. I mean, you can guesstimate, but if you're a bulk buyer of service, your bill might be $10 million off where you thought it would be, up or down. And that's the error bars, are just painful. So looking at the USF now, we've got a long history. At this point, some entities have been dependent on USF money and have built their budgets around it and their training around it, and they're specialized people who just work with USF issues who've been doing this for 27 years. And there's a huge amount of dependence there that you can't just remove overnight. At the same time, the base for USF funding is dwindling and dwindling. I mean, I've got a landline in my house, but it's not connected to service. And a lot of new builds don't have a landline at all. And personally, I've been primarily on my cell phone since 2010 or thereabouts. I was at the time I was a lawyer in private practice, so I wasn't at home anyway, and I might as well get my calls when they were live instead of on an answering machine when I got home at 11:30 p.m. Right? So I guess what I'm saying is you look at the USF programs, and there's a huge amount of dependency there that's based on path dependence from how we got from 96 to today, and yet it seems massively unsustainable. And I guess I would say, look, if you look at a social network, what adds value to a social network? Not individual nodes, but the size of the network itself, right? This is well understood. And if you are a company that relies on having a large user base, and that large user base is enabled by telecommunications infrastructure to which you are structurally a non-contributor, then I guess you have to ask yourself the question, do we even want to be non-contributors to this? Like, do we even want to place the burden of maintaining the infrastructure that our business depends on parties that are not beholden to us and are going to try and disintermediate us if they can? And maybe you'll say, yeah, I'm a pirate, I'll hoist the black flag. I'm not afraid of being disintermediated because I'm just better and faster and tougher. But it strikes me that increasingly when you look at the benefit of the network effects, if an ISP adds a new customer, that's just a customer to that ISP. They may or may not be a particularly profitable customer, it's one customer. But the creation of that ISP customer probably also creates a Google customer and a Microsoft customer and an Amazon customer, quite possibly a Netflix customer. And of course, customers for all of the ancillary services. Even if they don't directly have an Amazon account, odds are that they touch AWS in some way, that sort of thing. And so if we were to look back at Bell and say, Monopoly era Bell, and say, Bell has to establish universal service because its network is too valuable for people to be left off of, and they can't be full participants in American life. That's sort of what we're saying about the high-cost programs and other things that are subsidized by USF today. And therefore, we have to ask ourselves, what's the logical contribution base for this? And if the answer is obvious, but there's no regulatory framework for it, and there's no regulatory framework for it because there's no legal framework for it, well, then I guess we understand the challenge before us. But at this point, the USF charges are, I guess the other thing is they're so high that anyone who doesn't have to pay them has found a way to route around them. And the base is already down by about 2/3 from what it was at its peak. It's just going to get smaller and smaller. So no future in it as it lies. We've got to revise it.
So going from USF, now there's a lot of effort around satellite at the FCC. I think you have a new person in your office, not your office, but the FCC, focusing on satellite. So what's going on there? What's the FCC's interest, and what areas are they focusing on?
Well, so one number that I found really striking when I came across it, Rick, is that about 80% of the satellites that went up in the last 5 years. So the emergent LEO satellite business is immensely impactful. Now, low Earth orbit satellites per se are nothing new. I mean, if you think back to the earliest days of Iridium, that was a Motorola initiative. I want to say late 90s. And those are all low Earth orbit satellites, and there were 66 of them, so constellations aren't new either. It's not new as a concept. Still, there's a difference between 66 and like 3,000. And there are now multiple constellations, some of which are already deploying at scale, that are mooted to be, at that number. So the FCC, I think, grew up in an environment, and let's not forget our heritage goes back to the earliest days of the New Deal, right? So we grew up in an environment that didn't have satellite, and then when it had satellite, they were sparse, high, and large, and very often operated by national governments or by international consortia. So you go from that to the current environment where there's a huge private low Earth orbit satellite business, and these guys, they come out of Silicon Valley very often in their mentality. So they're asking us all the time, why can't I switch the frequency I'm using? Why can't I deliver services to ships instead of planes? Because I've got more ship customers and the plane customers dropped out. Whatever it might be, we need to be more nimble. We need to be flexible in how we address the question of frequencies, power levels, antenna directions, orbits, more so than in the past because it's a more rapidly changing marketplace. And then we need to think about debris in a new way as well. Low Earth orbit debris isn't as bad as high debris. It doesn't last as long. But on the other hand, we're putting a lot of satellites up there. On the third hand, those satellites are very often highly coordinated. So we need a regulatory framework that understands that highly coordinated satellites don't have like atomic individual risk in the same sense. Like, I mean, I drive down 495 all the time. I would worry if any car could just randomly, jump 3 feet to the left or to the right, right?
They do sometimes.
They do some, yeah, and I worry. But if all of them were doing that all the time, then you would say, okay, you've got a certain risk level. On the other hand, if people are generally staying in their lanes and staying within 30 miles or so of the speed limit, then you've got a slightly different sense of it. So I'm very happy to be at this FCC right now at this time working on satellite. Because the chairwoman has taken such great steps to take it in the right direction. I've got really high hopes that we are going to keep supporting American leadership in this area.
Well, Nathan, thank you for all you're doing at the FCC and sharing your insights with this group. And I look forward to see what happens out in space and on Earth and everywhere else that the FCC seems to be now. So thank you very much.
Rick, absolutely a pleasure.